At dawn on the 12th of July 1346, as the sun rose and the first light illuminated the sea off the Normandy coast, a terrible sight would have greeted anyone who stood looking out. Out of the haze loomed a massive fleet, almost 1,000 ships strong.
The landing craft beached, and the first wave of men scrambled out and waded towards the shore. They were expecting the worst. Above their heads, crossbow bolts fizzed. They returned a volley of longbow arrows of their own and continued their surge up the beach. This wasn't a liberation, it was an invasion.
These men were at the spearhead of 15,000 soldiers. 15,000 soldiers who would unleash hell on anyone and anything in their path.
A small band of French militiamen tried to stop the invaders, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. All they could do was fall back, take the road heading south, and warn everyone they came across, the English are coming.
At the head of the invasion was King Edward III of England, and this campaign, his Crécy Campaign, would go down in history as a great English triumph, heralding England as a powerful nation on the world stage, and Edward himself as a masterful lord of war. I'm Dan Jones, and I'm following in the footsteps of this campaign, learning not just about the lords giving the orders, but the ordinary men following them too, and discovering that the traditional story doesn't quite match up with what actually happened.
So a chevauchée is a campaign of total destruction?
Yes, robbing, raping, destroying.
He said, "Look, the King of France is not able to defend his lands and his subjects."
It's absolutely astonishing to look out on this landscape and imagine what it must have looked like in mangled corpses and blood.
The summer of 1346 was truly extraordinary, with acts of tactical genius and utter brutality, of total luck and terrible misfortune. And it all came to a head here, with one of the most defining battles of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Crécy. I've always been fascinated by Edward III's 1346 campaign. It's full of traditional heroic stories of King Edward and his eldest son, the Black Prince, as well as deeds of gallantry and chivalry by the French nobility. And that campaign provides the backdrop for my latest project, a book called Essex Dogs, which tries to recreate life among the ordinary men of Edward's army. And that campaign and my story both start here on the long sandy beaches of Valognes in Normandy.
The wide flat sands of the Carentan Peninsula are perfect for an invasion. So perfect, in fact, that they were chosen for another 600 years later.
Between L'Albe and Cherbourg in Normandy, the shock troops move in for the beach assault.
In 1944, the beaches just to the south of here were codenamed Utah, the landing point for thousands of US service personnel on D-Day. Thankfully for the men of the 1346 invasion, they didn't have to deal with concrete gun emplacements and machine gun fire. In fact, their landing saw almost no resistance at all. Apart from that band of local militiamen, Edward's army came ashore unopposed. They couldn't have wished for a better start to the campaign, but things didn't begin quite as well for the king himself.
Edward's own landing was far less auspicious. This is an illustration from Jean Froissart's 14th century chronicle, and it shows the king taking a tumble as he stepped off his boat and face planting onto the beach. Now, that could have been pretty embarrassing, but Edward was a masterly propagandist, and he said this just proved the land was ready to receive him.
Others may have interpreted this as something of a bad omen, but with the French nowhere to be seen and English troops flooding onto French soil and into the port of St. Valognes, any thoughts of evil portents were quickly pushed to one side. And in any case, for the average soldier on campaign, there was work to be done.
As usual, there are lots of stories of kings and princes, but to get inside the experience of the ordinary soldier, we have to read between the lines of the sources we have available. Now, here I've got an excerpt from a proclamation issued in Edward's name explaining how the army was supposed to behave. It says, "No house or manor is to be burned, no church or holy place sacked, and no old people, children or women are to be harmed or molested, nor are they to threaten any other people, except men who resist them, or do any kind of wrong, on pain of life and limb." But unfortunately for the local French population, there was a bit of a gap between instructions being issued and being obeyed.
Edward clearly understood the types of men he'd brought with him, the dogs of war. Men who were either so poor they had no choice other than to join the campaign, or were in too much trouble with the law to refuse. Within hours, St. Valognes was an English outpost on the continent. The supplies of war flowed through the harbour. The town itself had been all but abandoned, and while the men weren't unloading the ships, they were filling their own pockets. The town was stripped of everything of value. Nothing like an easy bit of loot on the first morning of the campaign.
The looting of Valognes might sound to us like petty crime, but actually it tells us a lot about the men in Edward's army. They weren't all rich aristocrats out to defend the honour of their king and their country. Most of them were just ordinary guys, here to make a bit of money.
To find out more about the men of the English army and the amazing logistical feat that Edward achieved, I'm meeting historian Professor Michael Livingston, who spent the best part of the last decade working on Edward's campaign of 1346.
Edward III brings 15,000 men to Normandy. That's a big army by medieval standards.
It's a very big army. It's a huge army, especially by medieval standards, as you said. So it's hard to support with logistics, and it's hard to transport across the English Channel, which is a big barrier in a pre-modern context.
We've got this number, 15,000 fighting men come to France with Edward, but give us some context. How big is that?
Yeah, it may not seem like a lot when we think about the size of stadiums, for football today, but it is a big number in terms of what it was like back then. We're talking about something potentially a quarter of the population of London.
Wow, and that's just the fighters?
Just the fighters. Essentially, you have to have a city on the move, something that can feed itself as best it can, get its own clothes, make repairs, everything that's needed. I mean, you gotta have people to mend tents, you have to have people to, drive the carts, to fix the carts, to everything that you kind of don't think about. We just think about army, fighting man. There's an enormous number of support here.
I've written about the ordinary men in Edward's army, but what's the sort of composition? I mean, how many nobles are there? How many knights? How many archers? What is the rough composition of the army?
It's quite varied, and it's awesome that you've done this and brought the common man into this, because too often we simply focus on Edward and the main lords, and they're not very many men compared to the 15,000 that are there. So you have about 15,000 men, 7,800 or more are archers. You then have a couple thousand mounted archers, and then kind of a motley of men-at-arms and knights beneath that.
What's in it for the ordinary guy in Edward's army? I mean, why are they going? Are they getting a salary? Are they getting bonuses? What's the point?
Some of it is salaried, which is surprising to a lot of people. Some of it is salaried, but a lot of it is also, this is a chance to actually enrich yourself through looting, through something you might accomplish, ransoms. There's a chance of making money, making a living essentially at going to war.
Are there guys who put their hands up every time the call to war goes out?
Oh yeah, there's guys who enjoy this work. They're good at it and they're ready to do it. They're gonna find work wherever they can get it and potentially even make their own.
How long is Edward planning to bring this army to France?
This kind of thing takes months. So the French knew it was coming. Spies, people knew that there was an army being prepared. They just didn't know where it was going. That's the big secret being kept from the French.
Now, in most people's imagination, the beaches of Normandy are associated with the 6th of June 1944, with D-Day.
Absolutely.
There are advantages, natural advantages throughout time to this spot on the coast.
There are. There are advantages and disadvantages. Advantage, wonderful beaches for a landing. Terrific, terrific. At that point, the Cotentin Peninsula is pretty marshy. There's really only one way in and out. Now that's an advantage and a disadvantage. It means it's going to be difficult for somebody to stop you once you get yourself a beachhead, right? But before that, if there's gathered opposition, you're going to have to fight all the way through it. And that can be a problem for him.
Now, when Edward arrives on the Cotentin Peninsula, on the Normandy beaches, there's a little bit of resistance, but it's not D-Day, is it? You don't have these ranks and ranks of French. Why not?
So most of the French army is in the south, down in Gascony. And so there's really only local resistance, and not much at that. There's sort of one guy who tries to sort of organize resistance, but he knows, look, I only have a few hundred men. I can't stop 15,000 Englishmen. So he starts kind of like making a delayed retreat, just trying to slow them down in the hopes of more forces gathering behind him in order to finally bottle up the English. The English have got to just move fast to outpace that.
Edward's got 15,000 men, and not all of them are sort of chivalrous knights by any means. So how's he going to control this lot?
Well, to some degree, he's not going to. I'm not even sure that chivalrous knights are that chivalrous. There's a lot of this that is sort of, we're going to pretend that we're one way. We might have to act another way. And that's expected. So yeah, things are going to happen that are going to be bad on the campaign. He knows that. But he's going to issue edicts saying not to do that. But yeah, his orders keep getting ignored.
Just routinely disobeyed.
Just routinely disobeyed. He walks in, I'm not going to burn this city. He turns around, it's on fire. It is just constant, this rampaging and pillaging and looting. It's hard to control this many men. It's just simply hard to do. Even in a modern age, we have difficulty controlling armed forces on campaign.
And Edward's not stupid. He must have known that this was a likely thing to happen.
I think he thought it was inevitable. To some degree, it's good for him if this happens. The men are getting paid and he's not necessarily having to do it. Like, this is a win-win situation. As long as it can look like, I disapprove, that was terrible.
Naughty, naughty.
Yeah, naughty, naughty.
Yeah.
I took care of those men. They won't do that again. That's the position he wants to be in.
In an army such as the King of England was leading, it was impossible that there should not be plenty of bad characters and criminals without conscience.
In 1346, the 100 Years' War was still in its infancy. Several skirmishes had seen the men of Edward III of England and Philippe VI of France clash, both on land and at sea. But make no mistake, England was still a small island nation. France was the superpower of Europe. But the Crécy Campaign in the summer of 1346 would turn that narrative upside down, and finally, the two kings were going to be at the heart of the action. Clearly, this was a huge invasion. But exactly why Edward landed an army in France has been the source of debate from almost the day of the invasion itself. And to begin to understand it, we need to look back at when Edward III came to the English throne.
When Edward III became King of England in 1327, the royal houses of England and France were well and truly intertwined. So in 1328, when Edward's uncle, Charles IV of France, died, Edward had a good claim to the French crown. And the French nobility had a decision to make. Would they go with Edward, or would they go with his cousin, Philippe of Valois? Well, they chose the latter, and Philippe became Philippe VI. Now, in 1337, Philippe confiscated all of Edward's French lands, and that's the beginning of what we now call the 100 Years' War. It escalated quickly. In 1340, Edward quartered his arms of the 3 English leopards with the fleur-de-lis of France. He was claiming to be the French king. So in 1346, when Edward invades, he's not just on some chivalric adventure. He's coming to claim his land and his crown.
He then descended along the Norman coast, sacking and burning villages and castles, pillaging and killing without opposition.
But of course, Saint-Va was just the beginning. The English began their move south along the road that ran down the spine of the Cotentin Peninsula, heading through Valognes on the 18th, Saint-Côme-du-Mont on the 19th, and Carentan on the 20th. The speed of the English advance was nothing short of frightening. The French could do nothing to resist.
The local populations had heard the English army coming from miles away, and by and large they'd done the sensible thing and fled. None of the towns was defended, the gates were hanging open. Edward's men just marched on in, but despite their king's instructions, they ransacked buildings and put them to the torch. The army's bloodlust was beginning to rise.
Within a week of landing, the Cotentin Peninsula had been left a smoking wreck. And now, the rest of the Kingdom of France lay wide open to Edward and his army. He could easily now head west into Brittany, where he had allies. Or else he could continue marching through Normandy, either swinging east towards Bayeux or south to Saint-Lô. It didn't take long for him to decide that he would continue his march south.
It was probably a move motivated by nothing more than good old-fashioned greed. Saint-Lô was a thriving merchant town, and it was firmly in the English army's sights. Now, Edward might have officially denounced the looting, but he would be able to cream off the profits of the pillage, and that wouldn't hurt with paying back the loans he'd taken out to finance the war. And in any case, the French were still nowhere to be seen.
When we saw that our enemy did not desire to come and give battle, we burned and devastated the surrounding countryside. Praise be to God.
But Edward's confidence in the lack of a French reaction was perhaps misplaced. The militiamen who had faced off against the English army at Saint-Va had been desperately breaking bridges to stop the English advance. And now the men, under the command of Robert Bertrand, decided to make a stand, hoping for support from King Philippe. And they would do so behind the huge walls of Saint-Lô.
Bertrand was confident that his delaying tactics would have slowed the English advance along the peninsula, and that he, his militiamen, and whoever else he could raise from the local population would be able to hold Saint-Lô until Philippe could raise an army and come and rescue them. After all, it was much easier to defend a city than it was to attack one. Behind these massive walls, the citizens and population of Saint-Lô would be safe.
It was a reasonable enough strategy. Stop the English at Saint-Lô, and they would be bottled up in the Cotentin Peninsula or forced to head west to Brittany. Crucially, the path to Paris would be cut off. But when Bertrand learned of the speed of the English army and that they were already rebuilding the final bridge over the River Vire to Saint-Lô, his blood must have run cold.
The English army was moving much faster than Bertrand had anticipated. There was no way he could make provision for a long siege, and there was no help that could possibly get to him quickly enough. So he made the gut-wrenching decision to abandon the city. There was no time for the citizens to escape. They were left to the English.
On the morning of the 22nd of July, the English army drew up in battle formation, ready to storm the city. But with Bertrand gone, it wouldn't be needed.
Word that Saint-Lô had been abandoned by the garrison obviously reached Edward and the army, but still the city wasn't spared. The chronicler Jean Lebel recorded what happened. He wrote, "Not many alive would ever believe the wealth of booty plundered there. A great many wealthy burghers were taken prisoner, and a lot of the common folk were killed when the town was first entered. A good number of the townswomen and their daughters were raped. This wasn't war, it was terror.
Edward himself refused to enter the city. He knew his dogs would burn it to the ground, despite his orders. That night, the sky would have glowed orange. For over a week, Normandy burned. Finally, as Saint-Lô was being put to the torch, Philippe VI, who was still in the outskirts of Paris, received news of the invasion. He would need to react, and fast.
But Philippe had a problem. His biggest army was hundreds of miles away in Aquitaine with his son, John, Duke of Normandy. So Philippe came here to Saint-Denis and raised the sacred French battle standard known as the Oriflamme. It was a call to arms. If his army in Aquitaine couldn't be here to resist the English, Philippe would raise another one instead.
With Saint-Lô secured, the English army could continue their rampage across Normandy. We can never know what Edward expected when he landed with his army. Perhaps he wanted to face Philippe immediately. Or maybe he thought he could march on Paris to claim the throne he thought was rightfully his. Either way, the treatment of the French population and their towns in the campaign left most people in no doubt. Edward was now waging a violent, destructive campaign, one that became standard during the 100 Years' War. He was leading a chevauchée. Normandy was an abundant landscape, perhaps the richest region in all of France. And in July, the harvest was starting to come in. Perfect for a chevauchée. I'm meeting Dr. Elodie Giard, who can tell me more about what this meant in practice.
Elodie, tell me, what's the purpose of a chevauchée?
The purpose is to destroy a land completely, to destroy the villages, destroy the crops, to terrorize people, to make them feel that they're insecure and that their king, their own king, cannot protect them.
And that whoever's commanding a chevauchée is the more powerful lord.
Yes.
So this is
course.
really old school warlord tactics, right?
Yes, it's old school, but it's also the best way to make war for Edward, because it's the cheapest way to make war. The Middle Ages kings could not pay their men really efficiently.
Yeah.
So the destructions, the sieges, it was a way of paying men, and it's not difficult.
Anyone can do it.
Yes,
Just need-
anyone can do
You
it.
need fire, something sharp. That's
Yes,
it. And a
yes.
bad attitude. So a chevauchée is a campaign of total destruction.
Yes. it
Destroy
is.
everything.
Yes.
Take everything.
Yes.
Terrify people.
Yes. Robbing, raping, destroying. Yes.
Once Edward lands at Saint-Va-le-Hougue, every town seems to be empty. The gates are open, the people are gone. The gates are open, the people are gone. And it happens pretty much throughout the first week of his chevauchée, right, of his campaign. Is that just because people were scared? Why did they run away?
They were scared and they knew that they couldn't fight against an army. They couldn't. And the lords were not there.
Right. No
So-
one to protect them,
No,
and they may as
no,
well
no.
flee. It must have been pretty horrifying to be sitting somewhere like this in Normandy and hear the sort of English horses, the hooves, the cries of men, the smell of smoke.
Yes.
What about the people on the chevauchée? Is this normal? You know, when I've been writing about this, I try and put myself in the mindset of guys on the English side being sent into a village to rape and murder and kill and burn and inflict all of this terror. It seems really hard to imagine. Was this just sort of normal part of war in the Middle Ages?
Normal part of war or normal part of life.
Right.
Sometimes we say we live in a violent society, but the Middle Ages society was really violent. These men, they were maybe, I don't know, they were craftsmen from a village in England or something, and they were going in France and doing what they were told to do.
There's a tension there, isn't there, in the campaign? Because on the one hand, you have Edward issuing orders to his own troops saying, don't kill, don't rape, don't burn, these are my subjects, don't go killing them, please. But on the other hand, he's got to know, hasn't he, that you've got 15,000 kind of thugs and murderers and people who are just here because they want to make a profit. How does that work? I mean, how can he expect that this strategy would work?
He doesn't expect it.
Doesn't expect it.
No, he doesn't expect it. But he's a Christian king, so he's got to show something. He's got to deal with the violence of his troops, and he's got to tell them, well, don't do it. You've got to behave like that, etc. Because I don't think that he wanted to kill a lot of people. No, he wanted to make them feel that he was really the powerful one.
Yeah.
Now the Lord King, continuously progressing and going forward, took all the large towns through which he passed. No one resisted, and all the people fled.
Edward's campaign so far had been smashing through wealthy merchant towns and huge swathes of countryside. Jean le Bel suggested that the path of destruction left by the English army measured 40 miles wide. For the ordinary soldier, the scale of the devastation must have been incomprehensible. Even for Edward, ransacking at this level was exceptional. But on the 25th of July, a new prize loomed into view, one that could make or break his campaign: the magnificent city of Caen.
Caen was a glittering prize for the English, filled with wealth beyond the imaginations of almost every man in Edward's army. And for Edward, it had great symbolic resonance as well. This was where his ancestor, William the Conqueror, was buried. And nowhere captures the magnificence and the importance of Caen quite like one of the abbeys William founded, the Abbey aux Hommes.
The Abbey aux Hommes, or Men's Abbey, was part of the improvement works that William made to the city in the 1060s when he made it a ducal capital. And when William became King of England in 1066, the power and the wealth of Caen was turbocharged. It was now no longer just a ducal capital, but the preferred seat of the King of England.
This is still William's final resting place. He chose to be buried here in Normandy, the duchy where he was born, rather than in England, the country that he ruled. And I don't think the significance of that fact can possibly have passed Edward by. So we can imagine him and his army marching ever closer to Caen, seeing this glorious abbey looming on the horizon. His determination to take this place must have grown by the second.
But taking the city was going to be easier said than done, because William didn't just build a great abbey when he improved the city in the 1060s, but also one of the great castle complexes of Western Europe. If Edward wanted to capture the city of the Conqueror, he would have to crack the castle too.
For Philippe and the French, what happened here at Caen was pivotal. If the city and its castle held out, if they bogged the English down in a long siege, Philippe would be able to bring his new French army here and drive the English back to the coast. But if Caen folded, then the English chevauchée would continue, and Rouen, even Paris, would soon be in Edward's sights.
Philippe was now commanding a northern French army, one that was growing continually in strength. But rather than committing them immediately to the aid of Caen, he waited.
Unfortunately, in practice, Philippe's wait-and-see policy looked quite a lot like dithering. Although he moved his troops north of Paris, he wouldn't bring them any further until he heard positive news from the siege. For the time being, the people of Caen were on their own.
The defence of Caen was left to the Count of Eu. But just like at Saint-Lô, the speed of the English advance left the French defenders with little time to organise. Medieval archaeologist Alban Godefroy is an expert on the castle at Caen. I'm meeting him to discover more about the fate of the city in July 1346, as the English army swept through.
What's the significance of Caen to Philippe and to the Kingdom of France?
It was quite a big city, maybe 20,000-30,000 people.
Wow.
And it was quite a rich city. They traded stones, wine and drapery. There was a harbour. So it was quite a big, important city, one of the most important in the kingdom after Paris and Rouen.
And it would be humiliating if it fell.
That was kind of the point, because Edward tried to weaken Philip, to weaken the lands. He devastated the lands. And also he tried to send a political message. He said, look, the King of France is not able to defend his lands and his subjects. So yeah, it was very, very important.
Here's Caen today. What would it have looked like in 1346?
In 1346, there was the castle, which was built in stone. There was the old town of Bourg-le-Roi over there. The abbey it was l'Abbaye aux Hommes there. There was also l'Abbaye aux Dames on the other side of the city. And there was l'Île Saint-Jean, which was the new town with more wealthy population. It was surrounded by rivers, l'Orne, the river Odon, and the canal. And the river Odon split the city in half. It separated the new and the old town.
So the new town was effectively protected by rivers and a canal. The old town, did it have walls? I mean, the castle had stone walls.
Yes.
Surely the old town had walls as well.
Yes, it did. There was some protection, some defenses which were constructed by William the Conqueror, but those were a bit old. It was made of earth and timber, and it was like 300 years old. So it was vaguely protected. And l'Île Saint-Jean, on the other hand, was protected by the rivers, but no fortifications whatsoever.
How did the people of Caen react when they heard the English were coming this way?
Well, I think they were probably terrified what was coming. First, they tried to improve the defenses of the city, especially the old town, whose protection was quite old. So they tried to make some quick patches to some walls where it was needed as much as they could. They set up barricades in the streets, especially in the Île Saint-Jean, which was not protected by fortifications. And they dug ditches also, but they didn't have a lot of time.
Why didn't they all just run inside the castle? Surely this was the safest place to be.
The castle was well protected. It was probably the safest strategy. But I think they also tried to protect the city itself. So they tried to protect their homes and riches, their possessions.
The assault on the city began on the morning of the 26th of July. Despite his better judgment, the Count of Eu had been persuaded by the wealthy citizens of the city to deploy their troops outside the city walls, in their wealthy suburb of Île Saint-Jean. It was a decision that would have bloody consequences.
So we've now taken a walk along the ramparts of the castle and we're looking out over what would have been the new town in 1346. Just tell me what it would have looked like.
Well, the new town begins behind the church. There was the river Odon flowing behind that church. But you can imagine you had houses, wealthy houses for the inhabitants of Caen.
We're imagining a river running along here, a fortified, barricaded bridge with access to the new town. Was this the only way in to the new town?
There were more bridges to the new town, and also the water was quite shallow at this time of the year. So even if the bridge was still protected, they could still cross the river.
When the attack began, most of the soldiers didn't wait for a command from the king, they just attacked.
Absolutely.
They must have been really excited, the ordinary soldiers, about the prospect of the rich pickings over there in the new town.
Absolutely, yeah. First of all, they captured the old town quite easily. Probably there weren't even one single defender in it, probably. And then they assaulted the Ile Saint-Jean, which was the wealthy part of the city. So, yeah, the soldiers didn't even wait Edward's orders, and they just flooded this part of the city to try and grab as much loot as possible.
Bypassing the castle completely, the English smashed into the barricade over the bridge leading to Ile Saint-Jean. It became a gruesome front line as the French desperately tried to hold off the English hounds.
But it was quite disorganized. So it allowed the French to defend themselves a bit more efficiently, I suppose, because the assault was so disorganized at first. But then later, since the English were more numerous, they eventually conquered this part of the city.
So we've got really pandemonium. There must have been smoke rising from the old town, people assaulting the barricade, people wading, waist deep in relatively shallow water to swarm in. It must have been panic inside the new town.
Yeah, I suppose it was. There was many casualties from both sides, but especially from the French side. And yeah, you can just imagine probably, buildings being burned down, people being slaughtered. Some women were raped, sometimes they were killed as well. So it was quite a violent episode of the history of Normandy.
Absolutely terrible episode.
It was.
The fight was very fierce and prolonged, but praise be to God, the town was at last taken by force without losing any of our men.
The sacking of Caen was truly dreadful. The chronicler Jean Lebel wrote, "It was a great slaughter. The people of Caen didn't know which way to turn. Their houses smashed open and all their belongings plundered." And images like this from Jean Froissart's chronicle, which shows English infantrymen stabbing the citizens of Caen with spears and blood flowing in the streets. We'll never know for sure how many people were killed, but it's been estimated that by the time the English finally left, half the population of the city lay dead.
Watching Caen burn from the safety of his camp, the king must have been basking in his own success. Within weeks of landing in France, he had not only set alight one of the richest regions in the kingdom, but had captured one of the most magnificent cities in Western Europe, the city of his ancestor, William the Conqueror. For the ordinary men in Edward's army, it was the ultimate payday. They took everything they could, gorging themselves on food and drinking as much wine as they could manage.
The sack of Caen and the terrible chevauchée the English launched across Normandy wasn't some anomaly in the 100 Years' War. It was the essence of Edward III's campaign. And that's weird because the traditional history is one of heroism and chivalry and the brave English overcoming the perfidious French. But even when you look at medieval images like this one of the butchery that took place at Caen, you can't help but think that if Edward III did this today, there'd be calls around the world for him to be convicted of war crimes.
When Edward left Caen, he sent back a letter to England, giving detailed instructions for a new English fleet filled with supplies and men, to be sent to the French port of Le Crotoy in Picardy. For some historians, this finally marks a moment where Edward shows his hand. Clearly, he had no desire to stay in Normandy. And he also didn't have his eyes on Paris, at least for the time being. We can only guess that with 2 weeks of complete success behind him, he wanted to continue to reap everything he could and head towards his Flemish allies in the northeast.
Presumably this is a decision taken at Caen. Otherwise, surely orders for a reinforcement fleet would have been sent out before the invasion even left. But I think we can sense a growing confidence among the English. Edward knows the chevauchée is the best use of his men's time and energy. So after 4 days of rest and recovery, the English fan out again across the French countryside, spreading fire and terror.
So was the good, fat land of Normandy ravaged and burnt, plundered and pillaged by the English.
Edward's forces had sacked Caen, but they couldn't hold it. The French troops who had stayed in the castle soon retook the city once the bulk of the English army had left. But this was no longer a campaign about territorial control. After all, the English were destroying nearly everything in their path. Edward was challenging Philippe's very status as the king and protector of France. And Edward was now driving his dogs of war on towards an even bigger prize than Caen, the undisputed second city of France, Rouen. In 1346, Rouen was a city fat with riches. Merchants traded textiles, wine and wheat across Europe. Its skyline was a sea of glorious spires. And it was here that Philippe finally made his move. At the end of July 1346, he marched his troops into the city. Caen might have fallen. He couldn't allow Rouen to suffer the same fate.
Philippe must have been distraught at the sack of Caen, but quietly relieved he'd held his army back in reserve. Even better, he'd beaten Edward to Rouen, and his men now stood in the English army's way. Finally, Philippe held some cards in his hand.
The source of Rouen's great wealth came from the mighty river Seine. Trade from deep within France could make it out to the sea and to the rest of Europe easily through the city. But the river would now also play a crucial role in her defence. The city may have bristled with the men of Philippe's army, but crucially it sat on the right bank of the river, while the English were on the left bank. Any potential assault on Rouen would have to cross the river first. But for the English, this was a future nut to crack. They were still a week's march from Rouen, and for Edward, seemingly confident that Philippe would not come and meet him in pitched battle, it was another week to wreak havoc on French lands. But despite Philippe's indecision to this point, he now finally had a plan of his own.
I don't think anyone would describe Philippe VI as a military genius, but even he knew what he needed to do. As he moved his army here to Rouen, he reinforced the garrisons at every river crossing and ordered the dismantling of every bridge between Paris and the sea. There was now nowhere that Edward III could safely get his army across the Seine. The English king was walking into a French trap. All Philippe needed to do was bide his time, then strike.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.